the kind of the creeping realization throughout that film that actually, no, we are the bad guys is really interesting. But I mean, I've always had a brief for the other in films. When I watched Star Wars, I was really interested in the aliens and the cantina far more than the actual plot that was going on. I can construct an insect in my head that I know what it feels like. And so I have an empathy. I feel considerably more for insects and things than most people ever will. We have the resources and the technology to actually turn things around and provide for everyone. Enough people made things happen that made the world a better place. One hopes that at some point there will be another upswell of this kind of mindset.
Good afternoon, Adrian. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. And we've spoken briefly before and had a few Twitter conversations about, I guess, the central idea of this podcast and YouTube channel and my amateurish Sentientism project overall, which is it's trying to answer the two biggest philosophical questions, and I think the most important ones. What's real and what should we believe, and what and who matters, so epistemology and ethics, if you like. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop this very simple pluralistic worldview called Sentientism, which suggests that when we're thinking about what's real, we should use evidence and reason to try and work that out. And when it comes to what and who matters, the clue's in the name, that we should have compassion for, moral consideration for all sentient beings, any being that can experience suffering or flourishing. But having said that, I'm talking to the people in these conversations with a dazzling variety of different views. Some of them like Sentientism, others of them disagree deeply. So it'll be fascinating to understand your own philosophical journey and how that runs through, informs, and maybe is informed by your amazing catalogue of work. But before we get onto those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself to people who don't know of you and your work?
I'm Adrian Tchaikovsky, and I write books about giant spiders from outer space. I'm a fantasy and science fiction writer. I am best known still for the book Children of Time, which won the Clarke Awards back in 2016. So I think it's just going off my screen to get rid of it. Which is about a sort of post-collapse human ark ship encountering a planet where a species of spider has evolved into a kind of a human approximate sentience, and various things ensue, very little of which is hilarity.
Yeah.
I have written also a lot of other books. Spiders and insects and arthropods in various aspects tend to inform my work a lot, but also beyond that, the natural world as a whole is a main theme. I do write a lot about the other, and from the point of view of the other, and about the philosophical basis for how humans have and might sort of interact with non-humans, either that they create or that they encounter.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And that was one of the central reasons why I was so excited to get you on as a guest. One, because I admire your work greatly, but also because that theme of examining the human and our relationship with the other in all of its varieties, dreamed up and real, seems to be a central theme in much of your work. So yeah, it's great to explore these questions with you. So let's move on to the first of those big philosophical questions: what's real? So for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up originally in maybe quite a scientific, naturalistically minded, maybe atheistic, agnostic household and society, or one that was more religious or spiritual or mystical in some sense, and how that side of their thinking's changed over their life, if it has. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like to tell the story of how you think about epistemology and how to understand the nature of reality.
I'm very much on the science and sort of rational exploration side of that. I don't think my parents would have described themselves as atheists, but we weren't a religious household. And I mean, I don't know if you have American listeners as well as UK listeners, but it's something that a lot of Americans don't realize, is that the level of sort of religious activity in the UK is much, much lower on average than the level in the US. A huge number of people just don't go to churches. We didn't go to church at all. And I very much grew up with this, a fascination with the natural world in a that was very, very informed by things like David Attenborough and other sort of nature science TV shows. My favorite place in the world when I was a kid was the Natural History Museum in London. So that's kind of where I've come from. And I've had various dabblings with spirituality in the past. I went through a period of going to a spiritualist church and trying to get in touch with past lives, which was weird.
Was it effective?
Well, the problem, I basically came out of it with the general impression that it's amazing how many people have been King Arthur or Cleopatra in a past life. They are very, very busy historical figures. They had enormous numbers of spiritual descendants in later generations. It's amazing. Almost nobody has a past life where they were just a peasant who died of dysentery.
Yeah, it's odd that.
Despite the fact, so what, if we're to give any credence to that entire idea, what happens to all the poor souls of the poor peasants who died of dysentery? Because apparently they don't come back. Which
it seems to be some sort of class-based system of reincarnation.
It suggests some serious equality problem in the reincarnation market. And when I was a kid and a teenager, I believed in every damn thing, ghosts and cryptids and. I was desperate to find the other in the universe. Really, I was desperate to just find that strange thing that was actually true. And I read all of those, mysteries of the unexplained type books, and I was terribly, terribly into it. And then later on, you go back to that sort of thing, and you realize, well, actually, the only reason this sort of stuff kind of came over as terribly convincing, and oh yes, maybe there is something, is because they're leaving out 75% of the completely well-established facts. It's like things like there's some disappearance of lighthouse keepers, where it's the overturned chair and the half-eaten meal, and that comes from a poem. That's not from the actual event, but it's been incorporated into it because basic people who sell these particular kind of narratives are very, very keen on selling the narrative, and they're not remotely keen on any kind of real investigation. And and the problem is that goes through 3 or 4 iterations, then eventually you end up with someone who will try and put it forward as actual fact and proof of a thing that has happened, and the people who want to believe don't examine it. And I've got an examining mind, and so I ended up extremely disillusioned with the whole business, just because it's becomes weirdly kind of culty. It becomes really kind of conspiracy theory of, oh, we found the secret truth behind the universe, just don't look behind the curtain. And so I guess it's a matter of just, I'm still kind of looking for that strange, but it's a matter of where you look for it. And I look for it within more of a scientific boundary. And so you say, well, where can the strange be found? And so, I do, for example, strongly believe there is life on other worlds, purely on a probability measure. I mean, I know the Drake equation is pretty damn pessimistic, but even so, there's a lot of universe out there. Life on other worlds that we're ever going to meet is a different prospect, unfortunately, when you sort of crunch the numbers. But it's out there, because if you look, one of the things you get, especially with the biological sciences, is when you start looking at the details of how it works, a lot of it is actually extremely strange, and a lot of it is actually extremely interesting and impressive in ways you don't necessarily realize. I mean, if you look at the way, evolution, the way life develops and turns into other life, it's a really simple and absolutely persuasive logical argument behind the idea. As soon as you have any kind of competition for resources and a system of replication that is fallible, you're going to get evolution. It's just basically how that is going to go down, and therefore that's how that will have gone down anywhere those basic preconditions happen. You'll get evolution, and you get more and more complex life, more and more sort of a greater and greater diversity of life. And
even
that
beyond
must be happening all over the. Sorry,
and even beyond biological evolution.
Yeah, I mean,
it's almost a truism that patterns that are good at persisting and replicating will tend to persist and replicate. And
Yes, and there are some fascinating kind of weird edge cases of non-biological activity on Earth we found, and obviously there may be conditions elsewhere in the universe where you could get something that's truly strange but would still be recognizably like life, or things that would be life but that we wouldn't recognize as life, which unfortunately is also entirely possible. I'm going wildly off topic, which is, I should warn you, a thing I tend to do.
I like
because
it.
I just ramble.
But it sounds like there's an echo in the paths I think both of us have followed, because I grew up in a sort of anodyne background, Church of England sort of context too. You know, we went Easter and Christmas to church, and that was pretty much it. So I think I believed those things, but it was never a socially central thing. I never felt any pressure, and I drifted away from that in my teenage years. It still took quite a while, but it wasn't a difficult thing to do, whereas for some of my other guests, it's been socially, and in some cases even physically risky, to move away from a religious worldview. So that was quite easy. But I shared that same pull of wanting narrative and wanting some awe and wonder and weirdness. So I was, wanting to believe in the parapsychological and, all of these types of things. But I guess where I got to, and I don't know if you'd say yours is the same place, I've ended up in a very, if you like, boring, quite hard-edged naturalistic place where I do try and base my credences on evidence and reason. But as you've hinted at, that leaves you an enormous amount of space to find meaningful narratives and find awe and wonder and weirdness in reality. There's so much there. So I don't find that my move towards a completely naturalistic way of thinking sort of crushed the fun and the wonder and mystery out of it. If anything, it's added more wonder and mystery and awe and into the way I think about it. But would you say you do have a completely naturalistic way of thinking now, or do you still get this sense there might be something magical or transcendent or on some different realm? Or
I guess, I think I've kind of come to the point where I am pretty much entirely naturalistic, which is not to say I would say there is nothing, that there is nothing in any of these things that people say, but I would say, well, all right, where is the proof? Where is the evidence that supports this theory that something's this? Brian Cox had a really interesting take on this. He was talking about the Large Hadron Collider and the idea that you're breaking down the substance of the universe into tinier and tinier components, and you're detecting all the bits. You're basically you're finding all the bits that as Lyle Watson says, the dreams that stuff is made of. And the thing is, if you have, let us say that there are ghosts and you have an interaction with the other side in some way, and even if it's different, that needs a mechanism. The problem is with this sort of, you get people who they're quite happy to say, yes, I believe in science and I believe all of these, the universe works in this, that, and the other way, except in the special pleadings case. It's how homeopathy tends to go as well. Yeah. It's just like the idea that in this particular case, I do not need any of the evidence I would normally require, and I do not need there to be any kind of mechanism. I do not need to be there to be a subatomic ghost particle that brings the messages of ghosts from the other side to us. None of that needs to exist in the universe. None of that needs to be in any way detectable. And I found Cox's take on this quite compelling. It's just the idea that if you're breaking things down to that kind of level, and we have not found anything that would account for any of these kind of things, any of that supernatural stuff. And bear in mind, the division between science and supernature has not been it's not as if these are two completely opposed schools. Have been plenty of people who cross backward and forwards. I think Thomas Edison was very interested in talking to the dead, and you go back to the Middle Ages and what we think now of as medieval magicians and alchemists, they were scientists. They were trying to understand the universe with their frame of reference based on what they were observing. The fact only their frame of reference was obviously involved a large number of things that a modern scientist wouldn't necessarily think to include, like angels and stuff like that. But it was still a very scientific approach. And so I do feel the thing about the scientific method is it's not some sort of weird special case thing where you can use it to prove science things, but of course you can't use it to prove non-science things. It's a logical framework. It's not some sort of particular. It's not like, I mean, I've got in my one of my series of books, you have a bunch of people in the shadows of the Apt world who can do magic, and a bunch of people who cannot do magic and cannot even really conceive of it, but they can use machinery, and the magical people can't use the machinery. And that's a fantasy book, and that is not how the actual world works. There isn't this special case. There isn't this special case of things where the scientific method, don't look at the scientific method, it won't apply to these things, because it's a matter of basic logic. If this thing works in particular ways. It works in ways that you can pick up. And obviously, people have done, no one has basically proved that psychic powers exist with all of that study they did during the Cold War, when they were trying to spy on the Russians using telepathy. No one has proved any of these things. The people who claim to be able to prove them have been routinely exposed as fraud. And the fact that people are out there trying to fake it is in a way a kind of tangential evidence that it's not real. But I mean, in a weird kind of way, it would be rather interesting for someone to turn up. Actually, I've done this stone tape style experiment. I found that in the substructure of this building, you can actually find vibrations or molecular patterns that have recorded emotional imprints from the people who died there, and that's ghosts. And if you can make them replay, like the old, I think it's phenomenal Nigel Neal TV show, which is based, I think, on a genuine theory, and that, I'm not saying this cannot be, but I am saying show it to me.
And one of the ways I navigate that is almost make a distinction between two different types of naturalism, and sometimes my philosophical language is a bit fuzzy because I'm only a pretend philosopher. But on the one hand, there's a sort of ontological naturalism, which is just the statement that the natural world is all that exists and that there is no supernatural. And I think I end up there. But the reason I end up there so far, and I'm open-minded about being proven wrong, is because I think the most important commitment is actually a sort of methodological naturalism that doesn't say the supernatural doesn't exist. It just says, well, I'm going to use evidence and reason to work out what does exist. So you can imagine being a sort of methodological naturalist and conceptually being open to the idea there's supernatural stuff. Although, in a sense, as soon as you've developed evidence of any phenomenon, which presumably comes through tools, techniques, methods, photons hitting our eyeballs, sound waves hitting our ears, it almost becomes part of the natural world, because I'm not sure how you could ever have detected it if it didn't interact through mechanism.
That's the thing. There is no supernatural. Everything is part of the natural world. And if ghosts exist, ghosts are also part of the natural order of the way the universe is put together. I mean, this is building on what Brian Cox was saying and moving it more into the natural world that I'm most interested in. So I can't recall the specific details, but there is an idea that the chemical mechanism of photosynthesis basically makes use of sort of quantum level events as part of its energy generating. And of course it does, because quantum level events are a part of the natural universe, and evolution is extremely good at, over very long periods of time, finding the very efficient pathways to do things. Give it enough time, it can find more efficient pathways than we can by thinking very hard about it over a short period of time. So let's say there are, going back to ghosts, let's say there are ghosts, and if you have a ghost and it can move a coffee cup through extreme sort of supernatural concentration, it can move a coffee cup on a table. That's energy. Energy is one of the basic things in the universe. You need energy to make things, to do things. If a ghost can move a coffee cup, then the ghost has a source of energy. If there are ghosts, and ghosts have access to energy, even very small amounts of energy, there'd be a thing that ate ghosts. They would be parasites that infested ghosts, because that's a free lunch, a free spectral supernatural lunch for some enterprising thing to evolve to exploit. There would be things, the world would in some the world ghosts would not be separate and cut off from the world, only turning up on Halloween to rattle chains outside Ebenezer Scrooge's window. They would be a part of the natural world and the ecosystem, and things would be out there exploiting them.
Yeah.
Because that's how the universe works, and that's how evolution works. And if you've got something out there, then things would be out there trying to make a living off them.
Yeah, and I completely agree. That sort of meshing and that interaction and that chain, you almost definitionally can't escape. But I think the other thing that comes through what you've said is that I think to be a good naturalist, you have to be open to the possibility of seriously weird shit at the same time. I think the key is just, okay, don't put any credence in this weird stuff until the evidence is there, because there is a stereotype of a sort of scientific mindset that is sort of almost dogmatic in its own way of thinking. You know, we have the answers. We've done the randomized control trial. Nothing else is even conceptually
the maximum
possible.
extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence, which drives one of my friends absolutely nuts. He said, well, no, just claims require evidence, but it doesn't really affect. But what that comes down to is that, you know, if someone tells you that because of this handful of alleged eyewitness reports, there is a plesiosaur living in this lake in Canada, that is a pretty extraordinary claim. And you know, it requires more evidence than just some people saying they saw it.
Yeah.
To, for example, mount an enormously expensive scientific expedition to that lake in the heart of British Columbia to see what's going on. Whereas if someone said, yes, this thing that lived in this area we thought was extinct and now we've had sightings, that's a less extraordinary claim. You feel that you know, the odds of that being the case rather than a lone plesiosaur that has inexplicably survived for 65 million years whilst being a large air-breathing carnivore and still not apparently existing in any size, any sufficient population to give it any chance of actually surviving. That's, you know, at that point, I think you're reasonably safe in saying, well, look, you bring me the proof of this because I am not going out with my enormously expensive scientific expedition.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the reason that's an extraordinary claim is not just that we don't like it, because that would be unfair. It's extraordinary because it seems to contradict with all of the other background evidence we have of how the world is. So
yeah,
in that sense, I think it sort of does make sense that you need a bit more evidence to.
I mean, a lot of cryptid claims in particular, especially the ones where you're dealing. I mean, the cryptids that people like are big cryptids. They are sort of the sort of cryptid that if you had that even in a very large wild area, you would see big animals. It is the case that people are still discovering species of mammal. I mean, I think a few years ago there was a mammal species. And this sort of thing is trotted out to think, well, look, if this, then why not that? And the thing is, with the mammal we've discovered, it's not that no one was seeing it; they just thought it was a different mammal that looks very similar, and that's often the case. It's not. It's the idea that you can have something that is completely different to anything else in the area that people are just not seeing, except for excitable holidaymakers who just catch that blurry photo of the neck rising.
They're always blurry.
And the other things like minimum breeding population sizes, population genetic, things like that. These things tend to be completely ignored by people who are very keen to tell you there are lake monsters or there's a Bigfoot or whatever. And also then when you look at, all right, well, let's look at Bigfoot. Maybe there is a Bigfoot. And then you look at 15 different accounts of Bigfoot and they're all completely different. And they go from where there were this kind of gorilla to, yes, the Bigfoots came and took me into their flying saucer and told me the secrets of the universe. And it's just there. It's one of those, you have a group of people who think, well, we are the believers in Bigfoot, and look how many of them are there, but none of them believe in the same Bigfoot. And so that's when the whole thing kind of starts to fall apart, because there isn't one. It's kind of fascinating because we have always believed in those things. I wrote a book called Doors of Eden, where it's a book about people encountering cryptids because it's a book about alternate evolutionary timelines, and then there are doors between these timelines so that the thing that has evolved in this world blunders into our world. And that is why you get the plesiosaur in the lake.
Yeah.
Because somewhere else there is an enormous world full of lake-dwelling plesiosaurs, and this particular unlucky one just happened to have come through. And if someone actually found a thing and it was a real thing, I would be delighted.
Yeah.
I wouldn't
excitement.
I wouldn't just say, well, I'm taking my science and going home now. I would be really, really keen. But what I don't want to be is basically fooled by some cryptid snake oil salesman. Basically, there are many out there. And I guess I have a bit of a personal gripe there, because I feel that when I was a teenager, there were a lot of cryptid snake oil salesmen and similar writing all of those Mystery of the Unexplained books and leaving out most of the facts.
Yeah.
And so I feel somewhat aggrieved.
And one of the frustrating things about those snake oil salesmen is that they also claim a naturalistic way of thinking, because they say, look, here is the Yeti, and here's all my evidence and reasoning to support my belief there is a Yeti. But they've done it the wrong way around. So instead of what good naturalism is supposed to be, which is considering fairly all of the evidence and trying to reason in a way that is not overtly biased by your desired outcomes. I mean, it's impossible to do that perfectly. They start with a conclusion and then selectively piece together so-called evidence and reasoning, as you say, ignoring 75% of it to build the case. And that's not naturalism, right?
There's a weird kind of science cosplay going on.
Yeah.
I mean, you get so Yetis, you might get, so someone has written this very, very erudite seeming paper using all that kind of, science journal language, taking these 7 sightings of the Yeti and drawing up this incredibly complex family tree of all, not just a Yeti, but all of these different species of interrelated hominids that exist somehow out there somewhere. Based on these 7 sightings, 2 of which are European, 5 of which are demonstrably untrue and have been invented purely for the lols. And it's that kind of, if you want to tell folk stories about the wild things in the woods, that's fine. If you want to write a book, as many people have done, there's a really good set. Fantasy literature is full of this sort of thing, and a lot of them are very good.
Yeah,
that's fine. It's just this weird kind of putting on the white coat and turning up like someone advertising toothpaste to say, "Hi, I'm a scientist. You should do this. You should believe what I'm telling you." When the whole thing is absolutely built on sand. Is it?
Yeah, just admit it's fiction and enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, this is because one of the things I was speculating with some other writers with the idea, all these stories of the little people and the big people out in the woods, so fairies and trolls and big feet, and because a lot of the modern cryptids are derived from indigenous folkloric beings that were never really intended to be, this is a real thing that is there. It's something that had a cultural and symbolic purpose, which gets stripped from it when people then say, well, obviously this is a survival from the age of the dinosaurs or whatever it is. The idea that our stories of the little people and the big people are in some way a survival of human encounters with other branches of human life, because we know we were sharing the earth with various different types of humans at various times, with Neanderthals and Denisovans and a very large variety of other hominids, all who either sort of blended into us or just didn't make it. But that there might be some sort of recollection of that stored in our stories of little people and big people is fascinating and almost certainly not true.
Yeah.
But when you're just doing, well, look, let's speculate, let's write the story, you can have an enormous amount of fun with that. But it's a long way from saying, well, obviously this is the case, and trying to get it published in a journal.
Absolutely. So we've answered that first question. I think we share that sort of naturalistic stance. If we move on to the second crazily big question, one of ethics, what matters and then also who matters, that's often put as a challenge to people like you or me with a naturalistic way of thinking, because people will say, well, if you don't have, for example, a deity or a list of religious rules in the Quran or the Bible or somewhere else, or you don't have the threat of being punished in hell or rewarded in heaven, presumably you don't have any ethics or morality, because there is no external force pushing you into it. And you still hear that challenge today, strangely enough. But how would you respond to that challenge? But also more generally, how I guess, did you start off thinking about ethics, and how has that developed over your life? Do you have a sort of view of ethics, right and wrong, good and bad in general?
Yeah, I mean, my ethics, which kind of hopefully boils down to the general idea of try to do no harm and don't be a dick, to be honest, if I can use that language. Is, I mean, I've never been particularly a student of philosophy. I've never been particularly religious. I don't run about doing horrible things to people. I mean, the old adage of "do unto others as you would be done by" is problematic because everyone's sort of tolerances vary.
Yeah.
I recognize that I try and recognize that everyone's tolerances vary. You know, for example, I mean, I have an autistic son. There are things that are profoundly discomforting to him that make no sense to me. But that doesn't mean I should just insist he does them or experiences them or doesn't get any relief from them. In the same way that if someone would rather I use a certain pronoun, let's say, to take a fairly, you know, topical case, it's important to them. It makes very little difference to me. So why shouldn't I? You know, it's just, it's not. And
I quite like that adaptation of the golden rule, because, you know, the golden rule isn't a bad starting point on the assumption we're all have the same preferences and interests. But actually, it's not about treating others how I want to be treated. It's treating them how they want to be treated, and that is often different.
And it's one of those, you know, it's kind of your freedom of choice is important. And then you run into the point where your freedom of choice is impacting someone else's. You know, it's, and I think when you see people who are, I mean, freedom is an enormously touchy buzzword, but that idea, my freedom to do X overrides your freedom not to have X done to you, is when that sort of thing becomes problematic. And it's a matter of just being, it's kind of being considerate and being egalitarian, and recognizing the world itself is not egalitarian, so that you, if you're in a position and you have the luck and the resources to be able to, is just trying to make space for people who haven't had that luck and who haven't had those resources. I mean, like I say, I'm not a philosopher, and I'm making a bit of a fist of actually,
you're giving the
phrase I always assumed was a bad thing. Apparently, making a fist of something is a good thing, and I've been using it wrong all my life. I'm making a bit of a botch of describing it. But I mean, I'm also, one of the other things I'm very aware of is the other place as we all do, but very few people will admit to it, is I get my morality from other people. I am very, very aware that I am informed by people I know and respect who have this kind of worldview, who are considerate towards other people, and who feel aggrieved at the world being at an unjust world. I am extremely aware, and certainly being when I was growing up, being a white young male, disaffected, sort of socially awkward, found it very difficult to just get on with people. I could so easily have fallen in with a very different group of people, and I could so easily have a very different view on that kind of philosophy of selfishness aspect.
Why do you think that didn't happen?
I think literally because the people I fell in with were what I would say were good people. They were people who were willing to make accommodations for others, and willing to, and I'm not saying I was kind of in the company of saints, but in general, I've been in the company of people who are basically decent, and that the awareness of their regard checked my, potential impulses where I might have gone off and been a considerably worse person. But I know where I've been, sort of, especially as a sort of in my teens and late teens and early 20s, and that kind of very, very key, was very, very key formative area. I can absolutely see that if I'd fallen in with kind of sort of serious misogynists or whatever, I'd probably have ended up lapping that up, because no one exists. We are a social species. Nobody exists in isolation, and whether you're getting it from someone who's waving a canonical tome around, or getting it from someone who's harassing people on Twitter, we all get our morality from the people around us.
Yeah, and descriptively, is just inescapable. We have, I think, a certain degree of biological starting point that we probably have in common with many other non-human animals, which is about evolutionary drives, the benefits of some degree of groupishness, the compassion a mother feels for their offspring, those types of things. So there's some sort of kit that just, I guess, comes inbuilt. But then there's so much that is really through social norms, and whether it's parents, wider society, the groups we happen to fall in with, that descriptively just shapes what we think of as our ethics. But I think in sort of normative terms, what you laid out, and you said you made a botch of it, but I think you just probably described it better than many philosophers do, because quite often they get quite abstruse and complex, whereas the core of it, I think, as you talked about, whether it's doing no harm or is really about just considering the perspective of the other and valuing their perspective as they value their own. And to my mind, almost definitionally, that has to be the heart of ethics and morality. If we put a sort of supernatural divine command theory where you're just doing what you're told to one side, or you put an egoism or a nihilism to one side, or an extreme relativism where it's just arbitrarily what a group decides, when you put those types of moralities aside, and I think we should, that seems to be the core. It's considering the other and valuing what they value about their own suffering and flourishing. So I think it's a very strong core. And it's a core that I think runs through many religious people's way of thinking as well. That idea of the golden rule is very common. The idea of universal compassion, even universal love, is a consistent thread through many different religions. But it absolutely holds true through a naturalistic way of thinking too. And I think it did long before religions were invented.
Well, I mean, all right, so playing the devil's advocate there, I think I think that you don't need to look far in history to find a large number of extremely scientifically minded people who are absolute gits.
Absolutely.
I think that science can be misused as a basis to say, I mean, science as an excuser for race theory, for example, for saying that this race is better than that race, is that has been a thing at a variety of points in recent past, and it's still a thing now.
Yeah, absolutely. And arguably it echoes what you're talking about with the cryptids, is people who have a conclusion they want to get to, so they will, create and warp and then claim a naturalistic scientific approach to justify it.
I think it's a mistake to say that. Yeah, the basically, yes, the heroic championing science will make things better against those sort of superstitious religious people. I think that if you're honest with yourself about what science is, then the big difference is that religion defaults to a faith-based argument that effectively is not an argument because it cannot be argued about. It is faith. You're not allowed to argue about faith. You take it on faith. And if you're kind of sciencing properly, that's not how science should go. But it's absolutely the case that it's not as if when I say I'm over a scientific basis, I just go out and actually run my own experiment on literally everything I'm told. I'm still taking things that I'm being told by people I trust as scientists because they work with the way I see the world. So it gets really hard. I mean, I accept the theory of relativity. I understand it.
Yeah. You don't have to do your own research. A naturalistic approach can involve having a sensible heuristic for which authorities make sense to trust in what circumstances.
Yeah.
And I think the I completely agree. The idea that having a naturalistic worldview is absolutely no guarantor of having good ethics. I think they can complement each other well, because I think, having a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason is very consistent with the other tenet of sentientism, this sentiocentric ethic that cares about all forms of suffering. And I think it works the other way around as well, in that the understanding of sentience is really a natural phenomena, and by understanding what sentience is and working out which beings are sentient, that gives you a founding for your ethics too. But they're not guaranteed, and that's partly why I do have them as two separate tenets. There's one hand, there's a commitment to a naturalistic epistemology, and on the other hand, there is a commitment to a sentiocentric compassion. I think we need both. I don't think you can just trust that one will completely flow from the other.
I mean, when I was doing psychology and zoology in university, the thing I was interested in with animal behavior, and unfortunately the dominant theory we were taught about was Skinnerian theory, which is basically animals are robots. They can't really feel pain. You can quite happily go off and experiment on them to their heart's content, which is obviously a very convenient take on animal behavior if you're a scientist who wants to experiment on animals. And that's an entirely rational. That is not in any way, although you could probably get to this. People have got to the same point from the God made us steward of the natural world. That's not where Skinner's coming from. Skinner's coming from, well, we've looked at these animals. You can't actually prove to me that they're anything other than just sort of these functioning autonomous units. Therefore, they don't really feel. And, for a long time, you couldn't really do an experiment into the sort of inner life or emotional life of an animal, because that wasn't the done thing. Basically, you get laughed out of the discipline. Well, I'm probably massively exaggerating that, because I was never really in the discipline other than as a student. And that's changed now. People seem to have a much greater freedom to look at animal behavior and animal intelligence, and hey presto, we're finding enormously complex intelligence and behavior, and at least indications of emotional inner life in very, very simple animals. I mean, there was a thing recently that found evidence for dreaming in jumping spiders, which obviously I'm personally delighted about, but also they have, I mean, we knew they were very smart from the Fiona Cross's Porsche experiments, but actual evidence for rapid eye movement dreaming in spiders. And obviously it's not conclusive, but there's something going on there that seems to be absolutely analogous to human dreaming. That's amazing.
And I'd argue that, again, that Skinnerian approach quite transparently was really an article of faith and dogma, because that thinking was never applied to our fellow humans. And you can do that. You can say,
I genuinely felt that Skinner applied it to his fellow humans. I didn't think Skinner particularly felt that humans thought either.
Would he have done human vivisection without anaesthetic on that basis?
I don't know. I would like to say no. I don't want to.
It's a worrying track to go down.
Skinner or his estate, but I mean, it's just basically. I mean, in a sense, he was a man very committed to the logic of his case. And I certainly got the impression that Skinner was not particularly convinced that humans were genuinely thinking agents in the way that we think of them. And like I say, this is a long time ago, and I might be doing him considerable wrong, but this is the impression I came out of those lectures with, at least. And interestingly, of course, we now know a lot more about how the neurons in the brain function and come to decisions. And there is still some evidence that actually, no, we really don't think in the way we think we think. And a lot of what we think of as our motivation and our thinking process is post facto justification, which is in itself terrifying and fascinating, because it suggests that the real thing that is us is not what we think we are.
And it links to, I mean, there's some fascinating thinking going on in the philosophy of mind and the science of mind generally. And there's lots of different schools of thought, but there are schools of thought that suggest that our consciousness is illusory. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it does mean it's not what we think it is. It's, again, another story we tell ourselves. And there's also people who are actually eliminativists, who suggest that consciousness genuinely doesn't really exist, which is a slightly more extreme approach. And the approach I've taken with this sentientism idea is to be neutral on philosophy of mind. And it's just saying that whatever sentience is, whether there's a panpsychist way of thinking, whether it's just patterns of information processing, whether it is some other sort of dualistic character of matter and energy, whatever it is, it's still morally salient, because to your point earlier on, the essence of what we're talking about here is considering what it's like to be another and to try to do no harm and to have consideration for their suffering and flourishing. So I find that philosophy of mind space fascinating, and I have my own personal views, which in simple terms are that I think sentience and consciousness is an evolved class of information processing that probably emerged around the Precambrian, and we just happen to be the latest instantiations of it. And I think it just is the operation of this information processing, and our consciousness and sentience is what it feels like to run that information processing. But other sentientists have very different worldviews. I've talked to panpsychists and illusionists and well, I'm not going to try and say it again.
That's a lot of long words.
It's even harder than sentientism. But whatever it is, that capacity to suffer, that capacity to flourish, that sense, even if it's illusory, still seems morally salient.
I think that there's a big, I think the big sort of rational divide is really, is there something unique about that happened in human development, or potentially in primate development, or potentially it may have happened in, say, maybe also dolphins or something like that, that made an experiencing eye sort of pop into being at that very late point? Or is it a continuum where that eye has, like you say, has been developing as long as life has been developing, and therefore you have this long spectrum, so that simpler creatures may not experience things as we do, but there will be some level of commonality. And I mean, personally, I certainly fall, purely because it is philosophical. It seems more right to me, and it is more pleasing to me for this to be the case. And because I cannot point to my experimental data to say that this is the case, but this is how it seems it should be to me, that there is this spectrum and that everything is on it. Because we can, you can see, but what we might think of as very basal emotions like fear, basic drives like hunger, risk and reward mechanics in the brain, or the brain equivalent of something. Those are the things that make life do what it does, without which, I mean, if you have this is one of the interesting divisions between will we ever get a artificial intelligence, and if you get, because artificial systems do not necessarily have any of that. They don't have the drive to preserve themselves or reproduce or anything like that. They just, you can program a robot to blow itself up, and it will happily blow itself up, because that is what the robot is supposed to do. I mean, this is actually, weirdly, I'm currently writing a book with a robot as the main protagonist, and it is the robot that is not necessarily actually sentient in any way. It's just following its own kind of or directives and drives, and trying to interpret them as its environment makes them impossible to complete.
Yeah.
And it's kind of fascinating thinking in that way. That is not the way a living thing actually works, because even the most basic of living things will try and preserve itself in most circumstances, and then in some circumstances potentially spectacularly sacrifice itself for a particular purpose. And one of the things I do a lot when I'm writing aliens, or I'm writing uplifted animals or whatever, is think, well, what if you've got that as part of your background biology, how does that translate into a society when you get sufficiently smart? How do you, if you have a situation where, yes, when you breed you die, which is what happens with one of the alien species in Shards of Earth, what does that do for their society? What does that, if that is basically just an absolute key part of who they are, and it's so phenomenally inhuman. But at the same time, they are themselves a complex, vibrant species. They're not kind of utterly death obsessed or anything like that. So how does that work?
And it's so hard to step outside of that, because so many of those drives and impulses and interests are so deeply seated in us and so assumed and so unexamined. It's very hard to step out. But I agree with, at least when we're talking about our biological cousins, there's a surprising amount in common. So as a thought experiment, I had a go at rewriting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. And it was actually a lot easier than I thought it might be, because while there are certain more of the higher up the Maslow's hierarchy rights and things that maybe don't apply that broadly. Although with some of those, with a bit of interesting thinking, you could still apply them to other species. The most important things to us humans are the ones that we have most in common, and they are about survival and kin and sustenance and shelter. And so the more fundamental something is, I think the more common there are, common those needs and interests are.
Yeah, it's the freedom from rather than the freedom to. Is that big division in the kind of the idea of what are your freedoms and what should you be free to do? The freedom to are frequently very human things until you get down to something as baseless, say, to breed or things like that. The freedom from is very universal. Freedom from pain, freedom from hunger, freedom from freedom from uncomfortable environments, things like that.
Yeah, those are fundamental things that were around long before us humans. And I share your view that sentience, that capacity to suffer and to feel, is very widespread across other species. I think conceptually it could potentially even be possible in artificial or alien entities too. But certainly in terms of our planet, it's very widespread across animal species. And as you said, the more we look, the more we seem to find, whether it's understanding octopus intelligence or bees or other invertebrates, the conclusion only seems to spread broader rather than ever getting narrower. But to draw it back to the ethical question, given your stance of trying to do no harm and so on, how have you thought through your life about that scope of moral consideration? Because that's another thing that is really given to us by social norms. We start with family or friends. We might extend out to the human species as a whole, at least in theory, through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on. But there's also this critical point about whether and how we care for non-humans and how seriously we do that. So how does your thinking, how's your thinking and your ethics developed about that journey?
Unevenly and with a certain amount of hypocrisy, in all honesty, because if I was genuinely committed to this, then probably I should be a vegetarian, which I'm not.
I'd argue the next step as well might help when you learn about eggs and dairy, but
well, exactly, yeah. So I can absolutely appreciate that the moral standpoint that's based on, but I am very fond of a bacon sandwich in the morning, and that is a kind of philosophically untenable position, which I am not at any resolving, I suspect, any time in the near future. We've got there's a conservatory at the back of the house. During the summer, when my wife sits in there with the door open, I will just go in every few hours and evict all of the insects that have found their way in there, with as much care as possible, because that seems to me the right thing to do. And the idea of all of them just getting stuck in there and dying upsets me. It's that kind of, it is. It's very much the work of a sort of a philosophical amateur, really.
Yeah, but that is a sentiocentric, compassionate work, right? You know that you can't imagine exactly what it's like to be one of those insects, but you probably can guess enough about the basics that they don't like it, and you're acting with that compassion in mind. Yeah,
I can construct an insect in my head that I know what it feels like, and so I have an empathy there.
Probably better than most people.
Well, the other thing is I feel considerably more for insects and things than most people ever will, and I probably feel more disproportionately for insects compared to, say, I'm not. I think in the one situation where we had like an injured bird in the garden, some sort of falcon or whatever came down, and we made sure we locked the cat in and called the RSPB, and they came and collected and so forth. But I don't think I actually felt for the bird as much as I did for a trapped wasp in the conservatory. So that speaks to a bizarre skew in my own mindset, which I have professionally exploited, I admit.
You have to great effect. And that's one of the things I find fascinating about I guess the sci-fi, but also the fantasy genre, is it seems to very intuitively and very naturally grant moral consideration to non-human sentient beings. So whether it's artificial intelligences, or whether it's other species of that. But it's weird because I think your reaction is pointing at this because sometimes there can be extreme brutality and anthropocentrism and a colonial mindset and almost fascism. But in other cases there can be a very easy and open acceptance of diversity and, well, you're a sentient being, therefore you matter and it would be bad to hurt you. So
I think it's a very good genre of fiction to explore these things in. I think there is a chunk of science fiction fantasy that is not interested in exploring these things, and having a convenient non-human thing you can slaughter without conscience or remorse is terribly useful.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is there have been some very sly examinations of, I mean, I look at that particular attitude in my book Spiderlight, but probably rather more importantly, the film of Starship Troopers. John Verhoeven, I think I've mangled the director's name there, but that is a really interesting example of how we look at the hated enemy and how we whip up that kind of sort of that philosophy of hate in order to justify what we want to do.
And the dehumanization and the...
Yeah, and obviously there it helps, they're actually giant bugs. They are not in any way human or sympathetic, unless you're me. But the kind of the creeping realization throughout that film that actually, no, we are the bad guys is really interesting, and is brilliantly done. And I mean, it's possibly so subtly done that there do appear to be a block of people who don't necessarily realize it's being done in the film and are still sort of, yay, shooting bugs, when that's not kind of what's going on.
Yeah, I think you can sort of assess where people's ethics are based on at what point they realize we're the baddies, and whether they do at all is,
But I mean, I've always had a brief for the other in films. When I watched Star Wars, I was really interested in the aliens and the cantina far more than the actual plot that was going on. I watched a film called Battle Beyond the Stars when I was a kid, which was one of my favorite films of all time. But the reason for that was there is like this scary lizard man alien who is one of the heroes, and is genuinely heroic hero, and also gets some cracking lines. And that, I mean, honestly, my career as a writer is probably as much due to that film as anything else, because that film was, you had the permission to make anything you wanted to a hero.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be the guy from the Waltons.
Yeah, you can turn things around quickly. And I think that's one of the other things I think the genre does for me, is it helps us turn the lens on ourselves. And, I think that's one of the conclusions you might come to if you are, an alien species visiting this planet and looking at animal farming as a great example. I can sort of imagine what the conclusion might be about the ethics of the human species and the realization that maybe we're the monsters too. So it's a really interesting lens, because it enables you to step out of these really powerful social norms and just hopefully with a clear eye, sort of have another look at some of the things we're doing today. But that's been fascinating. Thank you. And the final big question, now we've answered what's real, what matters and who matters, is how can we make a better future? And again, I'm fascinated in your thoughts about whether, science fiction and fantasy, the genres you write in brilliantly, are, fun diversions, or whether they are actually philosophical tools for us imagining utopian futures we want to move towards, or dystopian futures we want to move away from, and how seriously we should think about them as those sort of thought experiments.
I think science fiction and fantasy can run the whole gamut. They can be good fun. They can be very, very serious philosophical tools that look in great detail at what if. I mean, The Handmaid's Tale is one of the all-time examples of that, for example. So, if you're writing a science fiction book, you do not have to have a serious philosophical point to make. But if you have one, you can make it, and science fiction is a very good way of making it, because it's a way of kind of getting people to think about an idea without necessarily immediately triggering all of their defenses about it. Because we are, especially now, we're living in an extraordinarily polarized culture where where a vast number of people are on a side in a debate. And if you turn up and say, you need to think this, they will say, no, I've heard of that and I don't think it. Whereas if you give them a hypothetical world that explores that idea, then maybe they will think. and maybe they will kind of, and maybe that will affect some level of change that simple debate won't, because we kind of know that when people are entrenched like that, rational debate does not work because the things you're debating with are not rationally held. Yeah, and like I say, I mean, I think if someone was trying to tell me what a pack of nonsense science was, I would absolutely be retreating into my shell with the same kind of hermit crab obstinacy. So I'm not in any way accepting myself. But if someone was to write a book looking at aspect of spirituality in an interesting way, then I would probably read that much more readily. And in the same way, I actually I tend to try and make my own point of view the villain in my books to a certain extent, because I know that otherwise I would end up writing hagiography.
Yeah. So you can use it to test and challenge yourself.
Yeah. So I do write about sort of evil atheistic regimes, and I write about characters who have who are positive characters who also have faith and belief and so forth, because I feel that otherwise it would become a soapbox, and the books would suffer, to be honest.
Yeah. And do you have a favorite vision of a sort of utopian direction we might go in? If we take the themes from this conversation and imagine a future where people are generally committed to a more naturalistic way of thinking, and they do have this sort of do no harm, don't be a dick, and maybe even thinking sentiocentrically rather than just about humans. Do you have whether it's one of yours or somebody else's that is a vision you like?
Oh, so you mean as in actually a specific book?
Either that, or you could describe one now. What it might look like.
I mean, as far as books and settings go, it's hard not to fall back on Banks's Culture.
Yeah,
to be honest, which is very, very extreme end stage sort of post unpleasantness.
Yeah.
In general, I mean, the thing I'm generally writing most about these days is really the domination of selfishness and greed, which sounds terribly trite, but
yeah,
it's just the idea that we live in a society where a small number of spectacularly self-involved and greedy people are able to persuade a very large number of people, whether it is through a religious dogma or through political dogma or through scientific dogma, that it is absolutely the best way possible for that small number of people to be on top. And I think as long as you've got that situation and all the other things it implies, and all the weird little kind of invented culture wars and fake scarcities and bizarre assumptions like, well, yes, obviously it's all to do with how well the shareholders do, and if the shareholders are doing fine, then everything is fine, and that will trickle down to us, and all that, and all these things that have been repeatedly challenged and questioned, and yet because of who holds the reins, that mainstream ideology just gets to romp on its kind of destructive course. I mean, I think if we're going to make it, and I don't just mean here make it a better world, but I think we're genuinely in the position now, if we are going to make it full stop, if anyone is going to come out of this, rich, poor, or whatever, then that needs to be unseated and challenged and questioned. We need to pull back from this kind of insensate rush to personal profit and greed, division and selfishness. The idea that you are only someone of importance if there are people below you who do not have the things you have.
That hierarchy.
If we don't get out of that, then we're doomed, basically, because it is a fundamentally short-sighted and sort of pan-destructive philosophy.
And there's a pessimistic line of thinking, which is a frustration that humanity as a whole, it seems to be quite easy to take us down those paths. As you say, even small groups of people can take us down those paths. I guess where I find hope is that I still think that most people have the capacity for decency. So if we can find ways of stopping us being led down those negative paths, there's enormous capacity, latent positive ethic in humanity, just because of our evolutionary birthright, if you like, and the thinking we've done about it. So I think there's latent capacity there. And I think the other hopeful thing is that even within the human species, we've worked out that as certain powerful groups extend consideration and moral compassion more broadly within humanity, through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, we've never done it perfectly, but at least doing it in theory and concept, and having that aspiration benefits the people doing the extending as well. It's ultimately really is a win-win. And I'd extend that argument beyond the human species. I think if we can genuinely extend our compassion to all sentient beings, whether in the wild and farmed, that will also be a win-win for us humans too. It's not just a selfless act of generosity. So I find some hope there too. But where do you find yourself sitting generally? Do you have a sort of more pessimistic or optimistic cast of mind about where we might be able to get to, or do you have a different sense overall?
I mean, I'm a natural pessimist, but even though there are limits even to pessimism, you kind of feel surely we will get to some point where the dam breaks and people suddenly realize actually these people don't have your best interest at heart. This is not the best way of doing things. This, we don't. The only way to stand tall is not by standing on someone else's head. We have the resources and technology to actually turn things around and provide for everyone, whilst also not completely screwing the planet. But what it would take is for the people who are at the top to have less. I mean, not even a huge amount less, given how much the wealth disparity actually is, but just less. And the mind-boggling thing is how you can have as much as these people have and still not be willing to part with any of it. The having becomes the thing. And at that point, if that's the philosophy, then fine. You'll end, if your end game is to be kind of the dead pharaoh in the planet-sized tomb full of your stuff, then I guess you're gonna get it.
Yeah, with armed guards at the gates. Yeah.
Well, no, because they're also dead.
Yeah, the armed guards are gone as well. Yeah, you're just the pharaoh in the tomb. Yeah. No, I agree, and I'd also echo that point that most of the problems we're facing aren't really that technically difficult to solve. We often have the technical solutions staring us in the face. It's more often those power structures and social norms and those behaviours, this human psychology and sociology that are getting in the way. But on the flip side, so far, at least to a degree, cooperation and compassion have proven to be somewhat adaptive so far, and let's just hope they continue to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's the one thing I fall back on when I'm feeling utterly without hope is the fact that, look, we got to a point where slavery was considered a bad thing.
Yeah.
We got to a point
by most people,
where
anyway,
in at least some places on Earth, a large chunk of the people had some kind of input into how they were governed. We got to the point where we went for quite a long time without a war in Europe. I mean, that record has been broken recently, but we have got to the point where we are able to cure a very large variety of diseases. Things have actually got better, and it doesn't mean they're not going to get worse.
Yeah.
But this did actually happen. At some point, there were enough people with enough, whether it was weird vested interests or actual decency or what, but enough people made things happen that made the world a better place.
Yeah.
Despite the presumably very large number of people around who were quite happy with the world being a worse place, so long as they were on top of it. So one hopes that at some point there will be another upswell of this kind of mindset, and we will make the world a better place again, and maybe we'll make it stick.
Yeah, progress is not guaranteed, but it is possible. We just have to want it and do it. And I would argue that I think non-human animal ethics is going to be one of those next frontiers. It seems deeply radical at the moment. It seems so counter-cultural given what we're all taught is normal by society. But again, with many of the examples you talked about, once that tipping point is reached, things can change pretty quickly. So we'll see. Well, that's been a fascinating, inspiring conversation. And what's the best way of people following you, buying your books, learning more about your thinking?
Yeah, AdrianTchaikovsky.com is my website. Twitter, I'm at Apt Shadow, which is remarkably hard to say. Those are probably the best places to get hold of me.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll include links in the show notes too. And I'm also going to follow up by sending you some suggestions for plant-based bacon alternatives and see if I can tempt you further down the vegan journey. I'll get you one of these T-shirts soon too. Well, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you for spending time with me today. It's been great to have you as a guest on Sentientist Conversations. Please stay in touch.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on the show.